now, and that you'll have to click continue to. And now I'll introduce our speaker. Dr. Brian Phillips is a senior lecturer in the Department of Government at the University of Essex and an affiliated professor at the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics in Mexico City. He researches and teaches about terrorism, civil conflict, and organized crime. Brian, you can take it away.
Thanks so much, Aaron, for that introduction, and thanks to Aaron, Eva, Brian Arva, everybody at START for the invitation, and all the organization. I really appreciate it. I've been a fan of START for a long time, using the terrorism data for a really long time. Got a little funding from START, I think 6 or 7 years ago. So I'm really happy to be here. Wish we could all be face to face, but hopefully in the future before too long. And thank you for everyone who's watching. Appreciate it. Let me go ahead and share some slides here. So the talk today, the title has changed a tiny bit from what was advertised, just adding in one word where it's now, how did 9/11 affect terrorism research? A look at scholars' disciplines, gender, and countries. And just to give you a quick overview of what I'll be discussing in the next half hour or so, is I'm going to discuss this research question, how did 9/11 affect terrorism research? Why I think it's interesting, where it fits into the literature, and then I'll get right into the data. And I should be upfront and tell you this is not a theoretical presentation. I'm not going to be presenting hypotheses. This is primarily a descriptive paper, telling you all about some data I put together. And I do have some speculation about causal mechanisms, which I'll discuss, and I'm very happy to discuss these things further in the Q&A or hear your thoughts in terms of comments. But this is a data presentation paper. And I'll discuss data on terrorism research and also on terrorism researchers. And there are a few main findings that I quantify, I show to what extent terrorism research increased immediately after 9/11, and also to what extent the number of researchers on terrorism increased right after 2001. Also, an interesting finding is that psychologists became the most numerous researchers in terrorism studies, at least for about 10 years. And also the percentage of female scholars increased substantially, even beyond the rate of increase that had been occurring before, or that occurs in academia or in research generally. There's a change in the slope. And also we see a more global set of researchers after 9/11. And again, this was not just the result of a gradual increase in a global diffusion of terrorism research, but that in fact, immediately after 9/11, you'll see a steeper change in the number of countries where terrorism research is being produced. So those are the main findings. But this question, how did 9/11 affect terrorism research? Let me start just because I realize some people in the audience might have been born after 2001. Just to quickly review, of course, on September 11, 2001, this was the deadliest attack by non-state actors, at least in modern history. I'm not sure in ancient civilizations, but at least in modern history, deadliest attack by non-state actors, without question. 3,000 fatalities in a single morning, massive consequences in all sorts of different arenas, including foreign policy, domestic policy. In the United States, the Department of Homeland Security was created. Insurance, healthcare, all sorts of things were impacted by this. The world was impacted by it. But terrorism research, which had been ongoing at the time, to what extent did this event affect terrorism research? And I think we all, assume that it changed it to some extent, but you might be surprised about the ways in which it changed it and to what extent it was changed. And so the literature, there's already, as you may know, there's already a lot of research on terrorism research, meta research, a lot of work suggesting that at least in the past, criticizing terrorism studies, saying it wasn't cumulative enough, that it wasn't, people weren't building on previous findings, there wasn't enough data being used in terrorism studies, not enough systematic or rigorous research, all sorts of criticism, important work being done by colleagues. Regarding possible effects of 9/11 on terrorism research, a couple of studies have suggested, as you might not be surprised, more of a topical change, more of a focus on Islam and the Middle East. But beyond the shift of topics of study, what about trends in research and researchers? We don't know a whole lot about who terrorism researchers are and how 9/11 might have affected the body of terrorism researchers. Additionally, a lot of studies only look at a few years after 9/11 or start a couple of years before 9/11. So I wanted to look at a longer term time span, time series to see possible changes. It's been 20 years now, so we should be able to look back and see what's changed since then and what was happening in decades before 9/11. Some analysis only looks at terrorism journals. This is important because, of course, there's a lot of great research in terrorism journals, but as I'll show with some data I present, that this seems to be a fraction of terrorism studies. Of course, a lot of people publish in general political science, anthropology, history, legal, or other types of journals. There's a lot of other terrorism research out there as well that's important to study. And so overall, that's what this paper, and there's a paper if anyone wants to see, I'm happy to email it to you. That's what this project is attempting to address these issues by putting together the most extensive data on terrorism research and terrorism researchers yet to try to understand the consequences of 9/11 on this line of work. So regarding the data, first regarding data on articles, on academic articles, I started searching the Web of Science, the 21,000 journals it has, for any articles with the word terrorism or terrorist in the title from the early 1900s until 2019. And there, you can criticize the search technique, but because I wanted to go back decades before 9/11, you might think perhaps we could search based on abstracts or keywords, but keywords and even abstracts were not so uniformly used until the 1990s. So for searching further back, I needed a more general approach. And also this idea of explicitly needing terrorism or terrorist in the title, this should be seen as a conservative or minimum count, because of course there are a lot of articles about terrorism that don't have those particular words in the title. So I'm missing some research, but this is a minimum count. We should think that the numbers are higher, but overall the trends should be about the same over time, just that they're lower than maybe what the actual full universe of terrorism articles is each year. This conservative search produces almost 7,000 articles, and interestingly, they come up in about 2,000 different journals. So all sorts of different types of journals, and often these journals only publish 1 or 2 articles on terrorism, but a lot of different types of journals. And then this took a little bit of time with the research assistant. I classified each journal by discipline. Is it a sociology journal? Is it a political science journal? I can discuss this. There were decisions that needed to be made. It took some time, but classified them to look at trends by discipline over time. And then I collapsed the totals to see the number of articles each year. And then for the authors, to get information on scholars of terrorism, it turns out there were almost 10,000 authors of those 7,000 articles. Some articles have co-authors, multiple authors. So this was a lot of scholars to work with, a lot of people to try to get information on. Too many, in my opinion. I didn't have resources to get information on 10,000 people. And also, it's interesting that a majority of these people only authored 1 article. And other colleagues have noted that there are a lot of one-hit wonders in terrorism studies where people publish 1 article on terrorism and then go back to whatever their primary topic is. And so I was thinking maybe these are not really what we think of as terrorism scholars, that they just only published 1 article in their career. And especially if it's only a co-authored article, maybe they only did the data, methodology part, and they don't really do much, they don't do other work on terrorism themselves. So with both of these issues in mind, I decided to focus on the 1,614 authors of at least 2 articles. This is feasible, this is practical, but also this is more likely to represent the body of what we think of as terrorism researchers, people who have published multiple articles on the topic. And then, again, with the research assistant, we went to work gathering biographical information on these people. What is their primary, the discipline they work in, such as the discipline of their PhD, a number of different biographical bits of data, their gender, to the extent that we can find it, looking on websites, looking at obituaries in some cases, and we gathered this information. And we also recorded the first and last year of a terrorism article for each author. And so this is, it's debatable, maybe there's a better way, but this is what we thought of as the best way to come up with the years that an author is active, is publishing on terrorism. What was the first year they published a terrorism article, and the last year they published a terrorism article. And then between those years, that's when we consider them active, so we can come up with a count of the number of terrorism researchers that there are that are active each year. And you might think that this might be a problem if a person publishes one article and then 50 years later publishes another article, then do we really consider them active that whole time? But that actually didn't really occur so much. And normally this seemed to be a pretty reliable indicator of when scholars were actively working on terrorism. But I'm happy to discuss this more. And then to get right into results, here we have the number of terrorism articles published per year, where the red line indicates 2001. And we see that there's a very slow increase in number through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. But in the 1990s, you're seeing about 50 terrorism articles published per year. Again, this should be seen as a conservative or minimum count because there are other articles that this title measure is not capturing, but let's say about 50 terrorism articles per year. And then after 2001, in 2002, you have more than 300 articles. So a 6- or 7-fold increase, massive jump. And it doesn't go down right after that. It stays at about the 200, 300 articles per year, stays there. Interesting jump in 2015 or 16. We think this is probably related to ISIS, but it's not as big of a jump in percentage terms as the jump you see around 2011. So just a massive increase in research on terrorism. And someone asked me, someone who read the paper said, maybe this is because terrorism in the world generally had been increasing. But here we see, using GTD data, that terrorism was actually decreasing during the 1990s through the early 2000s. Maybe you know this time series well. You know this trend where terrorism had, in terms of the total number of attacks in the world, attacks were decreasing. So it seems to have been 9/11 that caused this huge jump in terrorism research. And another way to look at it is the number of Americans killed by terrorism anywhere. It is pretty low most years, but in 2001 it was of course quite high. And so there are sort of two reasons why we can think that this should lead to a huge jump in terrorism research. The first is that, of course, this is a massive, horrifying, unprecedented attack. But the second is, to be frank, there are biases in research, and research tends to focus more on the United States. There's a disproportionate number of researchers in the United States. And so if this attack might have happened in the developing world, maybe the jump wouldn't have been as high, but the fact that it happened in the United States, I think, played a role. And so for these reasons together, this massive, horrifying attack, and that it was on the United States, big jump in research right away. The connection seems pretty clear. Also, we could think about funding, think about causal mechanisms. This is just, I didn't make this graph, but this is from a RAND paper where you see different Homeland Security projects getting hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And some of that money, of course, went to terrorism research. So there's a huge amount of funding for terrorism research. As of course, there was increased interest and concern and understanding why did this happen? How can we prevent it? How can we prevent terrorism around the world? So funding, of course, plays a role. So moving from articles to authors, how many people were researching terrorism? And we also see a huge increase here as well, where there had been a gradual increase before 9/11 through all those years, but the rate of change, the slope, changes sharply from a gradual increase to a very steep increase. Interestingly, it doesn't keep increasing forever. By 2010, it's sort of plateaued off, but still you have this 6 or 7-fold increase between the 1990s and the early 2000s, massive jump in the number of people researching terrorism. And if we think about who are these people, what are the disciplinary frameworks used to understand terrorism? With this graph, we see of the authors, what is their discipline, what field do they work in, and before 9/11, the sort of purple dash line is political scientists who were the plurality of terrorism researchers for all of the pre-9/11 period, right? The most common discipline of terrorism research before 9/11 was political scientists. Interestingly, and this is by far, interestingly, after 9/11, a lot of psychologists get into it. The solid blue line, and psychologists surpass political scientists for about 10 years, although after that, it starts to go down again. And so another interesting thing I think we see here is with the red dashed line, medicine research, so surgeons, pediatricians, physicians doing research on terrorism. This really goes up in the early 2000s, but then really drops back down to almost pre-9/11 levels. So medical research, it was sort of a temporary trend, and there was a massive amount of research, for example, funded by the New York City Health Department on health consequences of terrorism, of 9/11 in particular. And so that explains those sorts of things. But in general, there was this trend that I think that not a lot of people like me who just study causes of terrorism or the dynamics of terrorist groups might not realize that there's a massive amount of research on health consequences of terrorism. And this really took off after 9/11. But of course, it had been going on before. But after 9/11, it really increased, but doesn't seem to have been as much as sticky or as long-term of a trend. Political scientists keep going up. Economics, the dotted line, keeps going up, though. So while health consequences of terrorism, that line of work seems to be decreasing, as indicated by the medicine and psychology lines. Still a massive number of psychologists researching terrorism, one of the top fields, absolutely still. And in general, more and more people researching terrorism. Just to look at the comparison between political science and psychologists, we see that political scientists were about 20% of the terrorism researchers before 9/11, psychologists about 10% or lower. But after 9/11, psychologists go from about 10% to 25% of terrorism researchers. So a huge shift in the share of research being done by psychologists. But until around 2010 or so, when you start to see a shift, but even if they're not number one, they're still producing a huge amount of terrorism research, psychologists and political science as well. So another interesting trend we were able to look at, getting data on the gender, the apparent gender of terrorism researchers, is what percent of terrorism researchers are female. Where you see a gradual increase before 9/11, consistent with a gradual increase in academia, in universities, and research generally, with women entering the workforce in the late 20th century. But after 9/11, the slope of the line changes. And that's why these dashed lines are here to indicate the general trend before 9/11 and after 9/11, where it's a gradual trend before and a steep trend afterwards. And this, I think, is pretty interesting. If people have thoughts about what changed, I'd be happy to hear them. But one suggestion I have is I think that it relates to the dominance of psychology and health research and terrorism in general after 9/11, where you may or may not know, but psychology is a much more gender-balanced discipline compared to political science. So of these two disciplines which have had more people than anyone else studying terrorism research, they both were gradually increasing in terms of female participation in research, but psychology was always above political science. And in 2001, I think about 10% of political scientists working on terrorism were female. In 2001, 10% of political scientists working on terrorism were female. And the same year is about 30% of psychologists, 30% of psychologists. So the fact that you have all these psychologists starting to take up terrorism research after 9/11, and psychology is a more gender balanced discipline, this helps explain why the rate of increase increased to about 1 percentage point per year. Every year, there's a 1 percentage point increase in female representation in terrorism studies. More female colleagues working on the topic, getting closer to gender parity. But if I've spoken with a few very senior female terrorism colleagues who've been working on it a long time, and we're still trying to think about what are the specific causes there of this shift. It could be a critical mass was reached in terms of mentors, potential mentors and role models, or other factors changing in terrorism studies. But this is an interesting trend, I think, and a positive trend. One final thing I'll look at here is the number of countries with scholars producing terrorism research. And again, I would remind you that this should be seen as sort of a minimum due to the conservative measurement criteria I use, where before 9/11, you have about 10, 12 countries producing terrorism research most years. It's, as you might expect, Western Europe, Israel, North America, that's about it. And it's a gradual increase over time, but very gradual. Whereas after 9/11, it shoots up, just like everything else, all the other measures we've seen, shoots up to a lot of other scholars from a variety of countries. There's a global diffusion of terrorism research. And let me show you more specifically what that looks like, where here's a map of the year 2000, where terrorism research was being produced, and this is with the word terrorism or terrorist in English appearing in an article title. So there are limitations, but it's a few Western European countries, Russia, Australia, North America, Israel, I believe Japan at that point. That's about 2005, you've got more European countries, Egypt, South Africa, New Zealand, China. 2010, Turkey, Argentina, South Asia. 2015, most European countries, Nigeria, most of Southeast Asia, Mexico. So just a real diffusion in terrorism research. More and more scholars around the world working on this topic, producing research on causes and consequences and other dynamics of terrorism. And just going back to this chart, it doesn't seem to be just a gradual result over time, that you might see with globalization or increased in research production as it was happening over time. The real shift is after 9/11. And we can, thinking about causal mechanisms or pathways, we can think about funding here mattering as well, where there was US and other countries funding work in other countries, funding partnerships, funding connected to alliances. So this is something that could be studied more, but substantial increase, substantial globalization of terrorism research. And interestingly, we see that US-based scholars, and this is not citizenship or anything like that, it's just we coded the location of where the person was working at the time of their final article. Where were they working? And of scholars based in the US, we see before 9/11, the line's pretty flat. It's a little bumpy in the 70s just because the numbers are so small at that point. But it's mostly flat, around 60%. US-based scholars are 60% of terrorism scholars on average until 9/11. And then there's a peak just in 2002 when a lot of people in the US start to publish on terrorism, and actually even starts in 2001. You might be surprised, but there was actually a surprising amount of terrorism research in 2001 in November, December about 9/11. I don't know how they got it through peer review so fast, but the increase starts in 2001. And I went and checked, and those are articles about 9/11 published in 2001. But 2002, you have a peak. And then, in spite of no real trend before 9/11, after 9/11, it's a decrease. You see this interesting decrease in the percentage of scholars who are in the United States publishing on terrorism, because around the world, more and more and more people are publishing on the topic. And it's this consistent decrease. And by 2010, US-based scholars are a minority in the world, still the plurality, but a minority in the world in terms of publishing on terrorism research, because scholars in so many other countries are publishing more and more on terrorism around the world. And here we see, when we break it down, that US-based scholars and non-US scholars both see this huge increase after 9/11. But interestingly, US-based scholars do actually see a decrease, do see a slight decline around 2010, perhaps as funding dries up. Of course, it's nowhere near pre-2001 levels. There's a lot of, you might call it stickiness or path dependence, where people keep researching terrorism, even when funding dries up, or often the funding, there are a variety of incentives or other funding sources that stick around, that don't go away. And so you see a slight decrease in the number of US-based scholars, but it's still quite high. Whereas globally, non-US-based scholars are it maybe reached a plateau, maybe continue to increase, but there is an interesting divergence there. And just to illustrate a little bit about how terrorism research continues to increase globally, here are a few comparable countries: the UK, Australia, and Italy. And in the UK, it was one of the few countries doing a lot of terrorism research before 9/11, for perhaps obvious reasons. But you see the 9/11 increase, and which never really stops. Slight dip around 2010, but the number of people doing research on terrorism in the UK continues to increase. Same thing with Australia and Italy generally. And a few other countries, China, Pakistan, and the UAE, really, there's not terrorism research before 9/11. Afterwards, it only goes up. And you might look at the vertical axis and think 6 scholars, 8 scholars, who cares? But again, these are minimum. This is a very conservative measure. They're almost definitely, more than that. There are people publishing books. There are people publishing articles with titles that don't say terrorism or terrorist. But overall, I think the trend would be consistent with another measure, that you see a substantial increase after 9/11, and it hasn't stopped. It's not going away. So with that, let me wrap up with some concluding thoughts. That 9/11 attacks, of course, led to a massive increase in the research on terrorism. And with the most expansive data yet on terrorism research, we can sort of quantify to what extent terrorism research increased, and look at some patterns on how it increased, and also in the number of scholars researching terrorism. And we saw that there's more psychological and medical research on terrorism, often on health consequences of terrorism. Of course, the psychologists study all sorts of aspects of terrorism, but health consequences is one aspect of it, in addition to the medical researchers. That peaked after about 10 years, declined. Higher percentage of female scholars working on terrorism, and a more global set of terrorism scholars. And so some next steps to think about regarding research would be good to get more biographical information on the scholars in terms of the highest degree they received, what is their actual citizenship or country of origin, race or ethnicity. There are all sorts of things we could think about regarding who is researching terrorism, especially when we think about potential biases or other implications of how research is produced. We can analyze all scholars, the 10,000. If anyone wants to gather information on the 10,000 scholars, I'll give you the list of names. Not only the authors of multiple articles, this could be done automatically perhaps, or manually. Books, one could do a search, as Andrew Silke has done, looking at books to see how many books on terrorism are being produced and what are they about. My analysis did not take books into consideration. And also, this could perhaps be a separate paper, but why do some countries produce more terrorism research than others? We can think of some obvious factors like the amount of terrorism in the country and various variables that are associated with research production generally, like wealth and universities in the country. But also, what about particular alliances or funding patterns, aid? What is it that encourages some countries to produce terrorism research a lot more than other countries? Is it just a security threat, or what other dynamics are going on? That might be something interesting to look at in the future. And this could be done with the data that I have. But finally, from a broader sort of scientific viewpoint, is there any other one-day event that ever led to or affected so much research? Maybe certain inventions or an election of a president, but I struggle to think of a comparable event or phenomenon that so fundamentally shaped an ongoing line of research. You can think about inventions that led to new lines of research, but this to me seems like quite a fascinating and remarkable phenomenon, and I wonder if there are comparable events that we could think about in a comparative fashion. But I'll go ahead and stop there, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks so much.
It was great, Brian. Thank you. We have a lot of fantastic questions in the Q&A. As a reminder, if you do have a question, please drop it in there. I'm afraid I do have to end it strictly at the top of the hour, but we'll get to as many of your questions as possible until then. Brian, I think just a practical question before then, would it be possible for people to reach out to you to get the slides for this presentation?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
okay, great. And would it be all right if I dropped your email address in the chat for everybody?
Sure, yeah, thanks.
Great. While I'm doing that, you're welcome to answer. We have a methodological question. You mentioned the decision to search for articles with terrorism in the title and that this was an undercount. Would it be worth it to just do a search for terrorism as a keyword and whether terrorism is mentioned in the article at all to understand the scale to which this might be an undercount?
That's a really good question. Yeah, so it would be interesting to look at to sort of compare. As I suggested in the talk, I wanted to see not just the change from the 90s to the early 2000s, but longer term trends. And going back to the 1970s, a lot of articles don't have keywords or even abstracts. So searching for keywords isn't so feasible. And if the word is mentioned in an article, that would be interesting, but I think it's going to be very different. You're going to get a very different body of research because a lot of articles mention terrorism once, but just as a sort of robustness check or to see if the patterns are the same, that would be a good idea, and it would be interesting to see what comes out of that. Thank you.
And our next question is about how much of terrorism research relatively do people focus on CBRN? So for everyone, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear versus explosives when focusing on means?
That's a good question. I don't know the percentage. I didn't do an analysis of topics like that. I think it's a pretty small percentage, but some people would argue it's a disproportionate amount compared to how much CBRN terrorism there actually is. But I guess it's because of the possibility of CBRN terrorism is so terrifying, particularly the nuclear terrorism, is that the potential is so scary that there is a good deal of research on it, but it's still overall a pretty small percentage of terrorism research, I would say.
Sure. And do you think that more people from IT and the computer engineering streams have been involved in terrorism research over the years?
It's a good question. They're just from my own eyeballing of the data, there is some engineering work because I had to categorize all these journals. There's some engineering work, but it's more from a practical standpoint in terms of, building a building that can withstand terrorist attacks. So there is some engineering work. Again, practical from an urban design sort of planning approach. There is a decent amount of that. Regarding IT, of course, there's concern about cyber terrorism. And increasingly, you have computer scientists pairing up with perhaps social scientists to do big data research. So it is a growing area, I think. But I couldn't tell you about the specific trends over time.
Sure. And did you examine other collections of scholarly literature along with Web of Science, such as JSTOR or EBSCO?
No, that's a good question. Only Web of Science. I just did the one for this particular project. So a lot of journals are in there. Of the terrorism journals, most of them are in, but not all. So there are trade-offs, but with the particular search approach I was using, it made more sense just to focus on this one particular one, but it would be interesting to do a complementary search or perhaps combine the two. But this one was fairly comprehensive and did include a massive amount of research, I would say.
Sure. In terms of gender balance among terrorism researchers, were you able to conduct any research on what percentage of the female scholars were first authors versus co-authors?
Oh, I did not. That's I'm going to write that down. Thank you very much. And I am keeping track of all the other comments as well. But that's a really good point that I appreciate. I did not, but I could do that. That would be interesting to look at. Thank you.
And I also can send you the question report at the end of this, so you don't have to worry about missing out on anything.
Thanks.
Sure. Our next question is, how do sociology and criminology compare to the subgroups you presented? Is there a much lower proportion in these disciplines compared to psychology and political science, or would criminology have some overlap with the psychology subgroup?
Yeah, so there is going to be some overlap where with a lot of these disciplines or topics or authors, it was a little difficult to nail down were they more in this area or the other. But I was actually surprised that criminology and sociology were lower than I expected. As a social scientist myself, I'm familiar with a lot of the social science research in criminology and sociology, and I was surprised that it's actually a fairly small percentage, considerably lower than political science or even medicine for most years. So I could come up with, and in the article I should probably report the specific numbers, but it was surprisingly low, I would say, I guess.
And could you please elaborate a bit on how you chose what publishing platform to use for your data collection, and did you consider other platforms and what potential impact of platform on the data and conclusions might be?
Hello, Aaron. I guess I'm not exactly sure what you mean by publishing platform. I plan to publish a peer-reviewed article and put the data online, assuming that's legal. But perhaps you know of a reason why that might not be able to. I wouldn't. I think I couldn't publish all the information, the contents of journal articles. There are real issues there. But in terms of counts of articles per year, I plan to publish the data on my personal website so anyone can use it. But if you have a follow-up question and if there's something I missed there, please do let me know.
And our next question is, do you have a sense of how the content of terrorism research has changed? Particularly, the questioner is thinking about increasing work in the critical terrorism studies tradition, and the increase in work coming out of the UK would seem to support that intuition.
Yeah, hello, Anna. Yes, I don't have numbers on that, but yes, I think there is more and more, and then the creation of the journal, Critical Studies on Terrorism, and as you point out, people in the UK, many of whom have a critical approach. I would say that there is more critical work as time goes on, but I don't have the numbers or a solid idea on that, but generally, yes, there is more and more. And then, sorry, just to follow up, sorry to interrupt, Aaron, but I think that's also consistent with the idea of a more global terrorism studies where you're more likely to see critical approaches outside the United States or perhaps Israel. And so as you see more research from developing countries, for example, I think you're more likely to see critical approaches.
Sure. And Brian Arva has a question for you, which I'm going to split it up into two because it looks pretty lengthy. But with relation to the increase in female scholars in terrorism studies, could this be because of the popularity of terrorism studies in academia post 9/11 and the large number of female versus male scholars pursuing degrees in higher education?
No, the short answer is no, I don't think that, because I looked at trends. I got the data from the American Political Science Association and whatever, British and other associations I could find, looking to see what percentage of their membership was female. And the lines were, in none of them you do see a sharp increase after 2001. I mean, yes, there has been a gradual increase overall, but not the sharp increase that you see after 2001, if that makes sense.
And then do you have a gauge on how much of the PCVE for our participants countering violent extremism and radicalization literature would be captured by your searches? These are very related fields, and I could see the drop in terrorism research in the US over the past few years being a result of scholars transitioning towards these topics.
I think that's right. Yeah, thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Brian. I think that's true. I did not do a search for the words radicalization or extremism, which became popular, particularly in the Obama administration. And so that decrease you see in the US, that might be mitigated, that might go away because people stop calling it terrorism, they start calling it extremism, and the related idea of radicalization comes up. So I need to go back and do some more searches, I'm afraid. Or maybe that's if any reviewers are watching, maybe that would be a good second article. But yeah, I do think that could be part of the situation and indicates a shortcoming of just using the term terrorism or terrorist, because over time, some people have shifted to other terms, but I think that bias is against my finding, where if I included that, you would see an even steeper jump right after 9/11. And that overall, my conclusion that terrorism research massively increased after 9/11 would still hold up with those measures in there. But that is a really good point, those terms. So, thank you.
And do you think that research from a social work perspective would be valuable to the field? How do you think it could differentiate itself from psychology-based research?
That's a great question. There is a decent amount of social work research on terrorism, which I honestly did not know about until I started this project. When I needed to go through and look at article titles and journal titles, I realized there was all this work on social work. I think it's consistent with work on health consequences of terrorism. How did the 9/11 attacks affect mental health? What are the best counseling interventions after a terrorism attack? So there is some social work on this. Some of it overlaps quite heavily or is also psychology work. But there a lot of psychology work is doing other things. But so in general, yes, there's important social work being done. It's not my area of expertise, but I do think there's room for more of that because it's certainly important.
And this is kind of a good follow-up question to that. Do you have an explanation for the relative decline from the psychology field lately?
No, I sure don't. I think hello, Nihad. I think it's I would guess, not to be too cynical, but I think declines in funding are gonna have impacts across the board. So maybe declines in funding have affected psychology research as well. And particularly, as I mentioned, that the city of New York was directly funding and directly producing. One of the scholars with the last name Galea, who's at the top of producing the numbers of terrorism articles, was on a team of people that were working, if I'm not mistaken, with the New York Department of Health and Hygiene or whatever, just producing massive amounts of research, often on psychological consequences of terrorism. But after time, within 10 years after 9/11, they'd shifted to other topics. This was de-emphasized. So that's at least part of it, is government funding decisions and shifting to other priorities.
Sure. And you kind of mentioned what might or might not explain the higher percentage of female terrorism scholars after 9/11, but do you have any other details that you could share with us or any ideas that might be behind that?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I don't have a lot else to say about that. I wish I knew. I think the increase in people from psychology, also social work, and other health aspects have played a role. But this gives me an opportunity to say, it's interesting that even as psychologists have declined in numbers, the percentage of women continues to rise. So I think that's interesting. And that suggests it's not only the psychology thing, but maybe this critical mass dynamic also being important, and maybe more institutional attention to pipeline problems and discrimination and bias yeah. So there are a lot of different things, but someone should research it more. And I'm interested in looking at it myself as well.
Sure. Our next question is, as you noted, interest in terrorism as a research subject seems driven strongly by events like 9/11, but also the rise of ISIS in 2013, 2014. Would you expect the recent increase in attention for right-wing extremist terrorism to fuel a further increase in research on terrorism, or is it still too diffuse a threat?
Hello, Bart. Thank you for the question. It's a good question. I think one issue is of course, we know that a lot of people don't refer to the right-wing terrorism as terrorism, so that could bring up problems when doing a terminology-based search. But this reminds me that I had meant to go back and look. When I was curious about the ISIS-related jump, I went and looked, and sure enough, there were a lot of articles on Syrian refugees, ISIS in France, Nice, whatever. I didn't think to look about right-wing terrorism. It's quite possible that the 2015, 16, 17 thing, that there was some right-wing terrorism causing that drive as well. So I'm gonna check that out. So maybe we're already seeing that, but if not after 2020, maybe we will. But as I suggested, it's questionable if we will, because people are more likely to call ISIS terrorism than they are right-wing terrorism. So we'll see.
Great. And this is kind of a good follow-up question as well. Given that the expansion started with 9/11, has there been some change since then, and when, in the topical focus away from Islamic terrorism? So more general questions, focus on the far right or any other type of ideologically motivated?
Yeah. Thank you. And this is a good question. Well, on the one hand, I would argue that there hasn't been a huge shift away from Islamic terrorism. Even after the Al Qaeda situation, ISIS came around, and so I would question the assumption, I guess, that there's been a shift away from Islamic terrorism. But if there has been, it's been towards right-wing terrorism, as Bart's previous question alluded to. So I do think that that's a growth area that we will continue to see more research on right-wing terrorism in terms of topics. Of course, there's more and more on the internet, on radicalization generally, online or offline. So these are some of the topics that are really, really growing. But the interest in Islamist or Islamic terrorism doesn't seem to be declining much from my perspective.
And do you think the results may have been different adjusting for cultural contexts? For example, searching for equivalents of terrorism in languages other than English, or for keywords substantively related to terrorism. And this research feels rather limited to Western or English-speaking research contexts.
Yeah, fair enough. This is a really good point, where I was searching for terms in English. But I would point out, of course, there's all this research showing that English is a language of research for many institutions and for many countries around the world, right or wrong, and with all the negative consequences of that. So, and this is why we did get huge numbers from a lot of different countries, people producing research in English in China, in Russia. A lot of the journals were not English language journals, primarily. They're journals in Russia, journals in German, that they publish a title in English, or a title in one in each language, or an abstract in both. And so a lot of the journals were non-English language journals. So fortunately, we did capture a lot of different types of journals, different countries in that regard. But overall, yes, this is ultimately a limitation. And one could start searching for terrorism in a certain number of languages. And find more results, definitely. So this would be a good avenue to continue to research. It's a good point.
Sure. And does your research look at scholarship on the terror-crime nexus, which may or may not be categorized as terrorism studies? And this is from the questioner speaking as a criminologist who works on cyber crimes and terrorist finance.
Hello. Yes. It's a good question. There's definitely work by criminologists that I saw that comes up, But as I mentioned to a previous person, I was surprised that the number of criminologists, same with history and law, I was expecting to see numbers perhaps equal with political science or psychology, but there just weren't as many criminologists publishing on terrorism as I expected to see. I'm not sure why this is, but the crime-terror nexus certainly is something that a lot of people are working on and continuing to work on from a lot of different angles. Crime-terror nexus means different things to different people, but this is something that increasingly people are working on, and I do think that we will see more and more. I think it's a growth area. See more and more research on the crime-terror nexus. So it's a good point. Yeah, thanks. And sorry if that's not a great answer, but yes, there's more and more of that.
Well, yeah, we don't expect you to be omniscient. Just know most of the stuff. We do have about 8 minutes left. I have one question left. So if you're hoping to ask a question, you can go ahead and drop it in the Q&A right now. But for our last question for right now, speaking of shifting away from Islamist terrorism, before 9/11, the U.S. stated that its biggest threat was eco-terrorism. After 9/11, how have research patterns shown the focus on eco-terrorism post 9/11?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not aware that the U.S. stated that the biggest threat was eco-terrorism. I know that there was a lot of emphasis on it, and even using the word terrorism for what was often vandalism seemed unusual. I'm not sure that it was stated as the #1 threat, even after the World Trade Center was attacked in the 1990s previously. So yeah, there certainly seems to be a lot less interest in eco-terrorism. During the previous presidential administration, you saw concern shift towards the Black Bloc, Antifa movements or associations like this. So of course, often there are political incentives or ideas behind who is the bigger threat and what should one focus on. But the vast majority of research seems to be on Islamist terrorism since 9/11. Although, as others have pointed out, there's growing work on right-wing terrorism and other kinds of terrorism. Not so much on the so-called eco-terrorism anymore. I've seen a few good things over the years. People continue to look at that, but not a huge amount of work, perhaps because there's not a huge amount of terrorism motivated by that ideology.
Sure. And it looks like that's all the questions I have for you right now, which that's great. We still kind of made our way through quite a few. But Brian, thank you so much for being here with us today. I think this went fantastically.
Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you for everyone who joined. If you like this event, please feel free to sign up for one of our future events at the link that I just dropped in the chat. And otherwise, everybody have a great day.